This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Hi, I'm Caitlin, a podcast producer here at C-SPAN. This week on C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast, law professor Jonathan Turley highlights individuals who fought to exercise and defend the right to free speech throughout U.S. history. Author and American Civil Liberties Union former president Nadine Strossen interviews him.
Jonathan, I am so honored to have the opportunity to interview you about your terrific new book. I have to say, as you know, I'm a longtime fan of your columns and of so many of your outpourings of scholarship and other writings. This morning alone, I have already received 2 columns about very important different issues. Yet I believe this is the very first book that you have written about free speech. And you explain that it took you 30 years to get the gumption to do that. Can you tell us what took you? You obviously don't have writer's block. You have the opposite of writer's block. So what took you so long and why now?
Well, first of all, Nadine, I've been looking forward to this interview because this is a mutual admiration society, because you are one of my heroes as a civil libertarian, as the former head of the ACLU. You've walked the walk. You're one of those wonderfully unreasonable people this book is about, you know, that people that refuse to be silenced. And so thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And indeed, it did take 30 years. You know, I was a bit of a dinosaur. I've always written law review articles, which are like little books in legal journals. And I really kept on putting off the completion of this book until I felt that it could be an entire package. I wanted to not just write another free speech book. I wanted to explore why we are still struggling with free speech, why it is that we go through these periods. And this book really looks at the periods and personalities that shaped free speech. But I wanted to look at what free speech really is, why we struggle with it, and how we can get through this period, which may be the most dangerous anti-free speech period in our history.
Well, that was a great overview of a really fantastic book. I certainly know that there is a vast array of books about free speech, several of which I've written in the recent past. So the question is, what is there that is distinctive about your book? And I certainly found a number of themes that make it unique and special points that have not been made by other books. Would you mind telling us what you think are some of those points, and I'll chime in.
Well, the book tries to be comprehensive and going back to the very origins of free speech protection, going back to ancient Athens, why free speech was first protected and the rationales for that. But it also looks at why free speech is a human condition. This book argues that free speech is a human right and that it's something that completes us as humans. In my view, that view was captured in the First Amendment at the very beginning of our republic, and then that clarity was lost. And one of the reasons that we have continued to struggle with free speech is because we don't seem to agree on what it is. We all agree with Louis Brandeis that it was indispensable, but we don't explain why. Why is it indispensable? What is it to us? And the book argues that this is not a right that we should protect because it makes democracy better, that it has this function in democracy, but that it makes us better, that it's something that humans need to have. And early on in the book, it goes to how physiologically and psychologically we are hardwired for free speech.
If I may chime in, as I say, the way I process this very important theme throughout your book is that you believe that one of the reasons why free speech has less support among the public and politicians and even the media, and also why the Supreme Court has not protected it as strongly, at least in certain contexts, is that we have overemphasized the instrumental or functional purpose of free speech in advancing democracy and underemphasized its intrinsic value to us as human beings. And that has led the court in particular and the public to underprotect certain controversial types of speech. Could you give us some examples, including some that are threatened to this very day?
Absolutely. And you know this from your own career, that often free speech fights end up in these trade-offs with the government. If you say that free speech is protected because of its function in a democracy, that it makes democracies better, then it suggests that some speech is more important than other speech, right? That some speech is considered valuable, high value, and others types of speech are low value. And then you're allowed to do these trade-offs, which we've done for centuries. That's what happened in this sort of original sin of the American Republic. That is, within a few years of the First Amendment being drafted in fairly absolutist terms, the courts re-embraced this Blackstonian or functionalist view of free speech, that it needs to be protected because we need it for democracy. And that put us on this slippery slope. That means that unpopular people whose speech is viewed as rageful or hateful, is given virtually no protection, while other speech is recognized as important for democracy. Well, what happened then, yes, of course, indeed.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was going to say, as somebody who has written in defense of what is probably one of the least popular types of speech that the Supreme Court has expressly called low value and continues to not protect, becoming more and more discordant with other decisions, is so-called pornography or obscenity, right? So I'm very familiar with the dangers of doing that, and we see that today in many contexts with the stigmatizing epithet pornography being used to censor library books and curricula as well as online expression. Jonathan, I agree with you therefore that it is really important to recognize the intrinsic value of the inherent value for all of us as human beings of free speech. But I also think you make a very powerful case, which I think the facts support, that even from an instrumental perspective, censorship is not effective, that censoring speech that is feared to be rageful, anti-democratic, hateful, use whatever epithet you want to, actually does not advance the goals of democracy or peace or stability.
No, that's very true, and that is raised throughout the book, that censorship has never worked. Look, this country was born in rage. That's what the Boston Tea Party was. We celebrate a moment of rage and rage rhetoric. And yet ever since then, we've struggled with what to do with rage rhetoric. And it depends on your perspective. For some, it's cathartic. For some, it's expressing the depths of their sort of disconnection with society. To others, it's dangerous. And what we see throughout history is that political speech is often treated that way. We've gone through so many anti-free speech periods that we have to really wonder why we never found terra firma in this country. But your point, Nadine, is one of the most important in the book. And that is, you know, when you look historically at these efforts, they all failed. You've never been able to get people to change their mind by punishing them, executing them. You know, Germany, for example, has had one of the foremost censorship and criminalization systems in the world. And yet they have a burgeoning neo-Nazi movement, right? It hasn't done anything for neo-Nazis, but what it has done is it's eradicated free speech. And so, while recent polls showed that only 17% of Germans felt comfortable speaking publicly about their views. So what have you achieved in that, where you have the burgeoning neo-Nazi movement, but all other citizens feel they can't speak freely?
I know, and you actually, I was looking for the exact quote. I can't find it. The paraphrase won't do justice, so people have to read the excellent book itself to get the exact phrasing. But you said that Germany, through its anti-hate speech laws, has achieved what authoritarian governments are striving for. And it's so ironic that this is being done in the name of democracy. Well, Jonathan, you've touched on what I consider to be a second major theme and unique contribution of your book, which is certainly signaled by the subtitle, about the importance of rage. You've already commented on that to some extent, but there's another really interesting dimension that I would like you to explore, which is not only was this country born in a period of rage against suppression of free speech and other liberty, but that episodes of citizen rage have repeatedly been countered by episodes of government rage against the citizenry. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, what's interesting about these periods when you go through them is how rage rhetoric has led to state rage, where the government responds with crackdowns on free speech, arresting hundreds and thousands of communists, socialists, literally in a few-day period, rounding up over 1,000 anarchists. That occurred regularly in our history. John Adams was the first to do that in the New Republic soon after it was born, right? They enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts, and he went about trying to arrest and even execute people who were his political opponents. This is the same John Adams that praised the Boston Tea Party, said it was magnificent. I think the word he used was majestic. His own, you had Samuel Adams, his kin, who helped lead the attack on those boats and the destruction of the tea. So the perspective of rage changes, and obviously when Adams became president, he became less tolerant of rage rhetoric. But you see it then with figures like Whitney, Charlotte Anita Whitney, who was a wonderful character that I start with because it was her case that ultimately led Brandeis to refer to this as the indispensable right. But the reason I started with that is because it shows the conflict we have inherently in our constitutional system. Brandeis got the case wrong. So did Oliver Wendell Holmes. Even though he said that, he ruled in favor of her conviction. So what did Whitney do? Now, Whitney was this is one of the many characters that I talk about in the book as following what George Bernard Shaw said, that unreasonable people expect the world to conform to them. So all history is made by unreasonable people. And this book is about just magnificently unreasonable people. And Whitney was one of them. There are people who just refuse to shut up. And Whitney came from one of the oldest families in America, a wealthy family from California. She traced her kin back to the Mayflower. She was the niece of Justice Field, would spend summers with Field. When she was at Wellesley, she went to a settlement house in New York, and she saw poverty that she had never witnessed before. And to her credit, she wanted to do something about it. And she ultimately became a communist and also an ardent feminist. But she was told back in California that if she gave any more of her speeches, she'd be arrested. And there were police officers throughout the speech, including one right behind her. And she proceeded to give a speech against lynchings in the United States and was arrested.
Yes.
That was the case that went to Holmes and Brandeis while they were on the court, and they upheld that conviction. So the question is why? Why do these great civil libertarians turn on free speech? And the answer is because we lacked that clarity at the beginning of the Republic. They did a trade-off that this speech was not viewed as functionally important to the democracy.
Well, in fairness, Brandeis used the occasion of that case to write what I consider to be the most eloquent explanation of why free speech is important, in which, going back to an earlier point we discussed, Jonathan, he talks about the intrinsic value of free speech as well as its instrumental value, that freedom of speech is an end in and of itself as well as a means. And there's rather a technical, wonky explanation for why what sounded like a dissent ends up as a concurring opinion. He had another rationale, which may be unpersuasive, for why he voted to go along with the majority's end result. But at the very least, that inspiring language set out a vision which, as you well know, was unanimously affirmed by the United States Supreme Court in 1969 in an ACLU case. So essentially has been the foundation for a generally robust modern view of free speech. If
Yes.
you know why he, his motivation for that concurrence, I'd love to hear it.
Well, it's funny because in the book I talk about that, because you're absolutely right. It is a magnificent statement in favor of free speech. And there's been debate since then of why Brandeis did what he did. There's some technical explanations of why he might have felt the conviction had to be upheld. I'm not as critical of Brandeis in the book as I am of Oliver Wendell Holmes. And
Yes.
I dedicate a very long chapter to Oliver Wendell Holmes. And the reason is that I really felt that if we want to see where we got lost as a country on free speech, you have to look at where Oliver Wendell Holmes got lost. Why he became...
Can I interject some? Can I, Jonathan, I'm so sorry. Before we go to Holmes, which was going to be my next question, because that's absolutely fascinating, but I really want to underscore something you said in passing about Charlotte Anita Whitney that I think really bears emphasis. It's a point that I did not know, even though I was quite familiar with her general biography and certainly with the case. You mentioned that the speech for which she was arrested, which led to at least an opinion that ultimately became the basis of very strong speech protection, including protection for hate speech and racist speech. She gave a speech that was addressing racial injustice, including lynching. And I had not known that until I read your book. You had very powerful quotations from her in which she said this is not just a concern for, she used what was considered the respectful term at the time, for the Negro population of the United States. This is a concern for all of us in America. And it was such a clarion call in 1919 at a time when racial injustice was rampant. And the reason I stress this, you'll understand, is because in recent times, in recent decades, it's just been assumed by many on the left who want to suppress free speech that we have to choose between concerns about racial justice and robust free speech. But Whitney is one of countless examples we could give where the two go hand in hand.
No, that is very true. And we have a number, I go through a number of these periods where anti-racism speeches were the subject of crackdowns. There are cases I talk about of the union organizing of workers, including farm workers, that led to violence in which these union leaders were rounded up. They were completely innocent. You have anarchists and socialists, including, of course, Debs, who was arrested simply because he opposed a war. I mean, this is core political speech. And yet those convictions were upheld because we didn't have that foundation in free speech, that clarity we once had.
Well, thank you for that, underscoring that really important point, which is so relevant to ongoing debates today. And now to Oliver Wendell Holmes, who, again, I think many people associate him with a famous dissent in 1919, in which he does issue eloquent statements in support of free speech. He does, along with Brandeis, dissent from upholding the conviction in the Abrams case. But please tell us why. I don't know if you would say he did more harm than good for free speech over the course of his career, but certainly did much harm.
Oh, I think he did do more harm than good for free speech. The reason I was intrigued by Holmes was not just that he was consistently anti-free speech in his opinions, and he handed down an array of decisions against speakers who were engaged in pure political speech. But it was the vehemence with which he would write the opinions that struck me as odd. When he would talk about natural rights, he would become vehement to the point of angry in these opinions. And I wanted to understand why. And in some ways, the research for this book corrected a misconception that I had. For years, I've taught in class that I thought that Oliver Wendell Holmes's view of natural law was an outgrowth of his experience in the Civil War. When I really drilled down on it, it seemed very clear that he had rejected natural law in college at Harvard. In fact, I think there's ample evidence that he may have been an atheist as early as college. But what happened is that those views then became magnified in the Civil War. And I thought it was interesting that I came across one passage that listed the books that he took to war. Now, keep in mind, Oliver Wendell Holmes was the most unlucky soldier in the history of warfare. Every time he stepped on a battlefield.
He survived. But he was the most lucky because he survived. But I'm sorry.
Well, it's just that he attracted lead shot the way motorhomes attract tornadoes. I mean, he would walk on a battlefield and get shot. I mean, and it's to the point that eventually, after his fourth wound, people were saying maybe you should take a desk job. But he, of course, fought with the brave Harvard battalion or division. And this was a group of Harvard graduates that were the officers. They're not Harvard graduates as people often think of as the enlisted troops, but they all fought incredibly bravely. They had some of the highest casualty rates of the Civil War, and he was one of them. But what's interesting is he went on these battlefields with a bag full of books, and one of them was Hobbes' Leviathan. And I thought it was, of all of the books that I wouldn't have wanted young Oliver Wendell Holmes to take on a battlefield, it would probably be Hobbes. And he really took it to heart. What he saw, the carnage, made him more fervent that there wasn't any natural law. That law was simply whatever was legitimately created in the system. And when he came out of that war, he was this virulent figure that comes out in these opinions. Towards the end of his career, and particularly with the influence of people like Judge Learned Hand and others, he began to regret some of what he had written. And he walked away from his most famous line about crying fire in a crowded theater in Schenck.
Which is I join you in having that as my least favorite line in the whole First Amendment canon, right? Everybody predictably trots it out to purportedly justify every possible kind of censorship.
No, it's incredible.
So I'd love it if you would comment on that.
Well, I spent a lot of time on that line in the book because you and I share this. My hair catches on fire every time somebody cites that line. And what's interesting, first of all, the line appears not to have come from Schenck. It appears to have come from a brief of a prosecutor in an earlier case that Holmes adopted, almost word for word. But it was a uniquely ill-considered line. And it has become the mantra for everyone who wants to support censorship. I was testifying at a recent hearing when Representative Goldman from New York, as well as his other colleagues, kept on citing that line. And I finally interrupted him and said, could I just point out that you're citing a line that Oliver Wendell Holmes later walked away from in a case that was later effectively set aside because of Brandenburg, but also a case where it was used to justify the imprisonment of a socialist for simply speaking his political viewpoints. And I was cut off by Goldman and said, we don't need a classroom lecture here. And so it was there's no correcting it. People love that line because it gives them license to silence others. They just say, now the internet is one big burning theater. And so we have a right to shut everyone up.
And you know, my pet peeve, which you also go into in the book, is that the line 99.9% of the time is misquoted
Yes.
by leaving out the very important word falsely,
Right.
and causing a panic, which are really important conceptual elements, right? Because the alleged justification is you are preventing harm by suppressing the speech. But if the theater is on fire, you are preventing harm by shouting fire, of course. So the whole logic for the justification in principle now it is ignored by that misparaphrasing. And of course it was misapplied by Holmes himself. One thing that again I learned for the first time in your book was that Zechariah Chaffee, who was one of the people he was a Harvard professor, one of the founders of the ACLU, great early defender of free speech, and is often credited with helping Holmes to change his mind later in his career, that Chaffee said the better analogy for Schenck would be if he was somebody who stood up, in a non-disruptive way during intermission and pointed out to people that the exits were blocked. Yeah. In other words, he was trying to protect their safety.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
No, he was brilliant in pointing that out. I think honestly that by the end of his life, Holmes would have loved to gone back and stopped himself from writing that line, because even by the time of his death, it was already being used by everyone as an excuse to silence others.
Now, if we can proceed from our least favorite lines to what our positive models would be for a robust interpretation of the First Amendment. When you were saying the least favorite book you would recommend for Holmes to take with him to the Civil War was Hobbes' Leviathan, I was thinking, well, I suspect the first choice might have been John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, 1859. Because you talk a lot about the million harm principle. I infer that you, at least if correctly interpreted and applied, that would be a mode for enforcing the First Amendment consistent with the human rights values of free speech.
I do, and I think that the brilliance of John Stuart Mill was that he really, unlike Bentham, who was sort of the supernova who exploded on the scene with his sort of libertarian ideas, his utilitarian creation of the foundation for utilitarianism, it was really John Stuart Mill who was the child of Bentham's secretary that organized these thoughts and produced something that was much more powerful in its impact, and that's the harm principle. And what Mill said was that the function of government is to protect us from the harm of others, but that's also its limit. That is, that the government has a legitimate right to keep us from harming others, but it also means that the government should restrain itself when we're not harming others. And Mill said that you don't harm other people through ideas, but the function of the law is this harm principle. And I suggest that free speech should be based on its own type of harm principle. And in some regards, this type of argument has been hijacked by the anti-free speech movement. Many students today have been taught since secondary school that free speech is harmful, that it's triggering, that they shouldn't have to hear opposing views, that it's traumatic. And we've created generations of speech phobics because of this the unyielding and unrelenting mantra. What I suggest is that we apply a true harm principle. Ideas are not harmful. Speech is not harmful. Good speech can overcome bad speech. But if we look at actual harm, we focus on conduct. That's the line that I try to draw in this book, because the end of the book tries to focus on where we can go if we have a reawakening of free speech in this country. And
before we get to those excellent proposals, if I could, Jonathan, I'd like to stay with the Millian. He's a great hero of mine. And I do have to say that there is evidence that big portions of On Liberty were co-authored by his wife, Harriet Taylor. So she's also a hero of mine.
Right.
So the harm principle, I think, is very important. But it leaves two questions. One you've started to address, which is what kinds of harm are cognizable for satisfying that principle, because today it is, I think, widely accepted, according to public opinion polls among college students and faculty members, among many other members of the general public, that even being exposed to an idea or an expression that you find offensive or even that you find wrong-headed is causing you harm. So we have to police the boundaries of what kinds of harm are cognizable. And equally importantly is the degree of connection between the speech and the harm. And that's another dimension that I think was best captured again by Holmes and Brandeis in Dissent/Concurrence, what's often called the emergency principle, that the speech has to either directly cause or imminently threaten the specific harm. It can't just have an attenuated, speculative, loose, indirect connection.
No, that's right. And of course, that was ultimately captured in Brandenburg, requiring that imminent outbreak of violence and criminal conduct. And that was a high point for the court, where they'd come a great distance from cases like Schenck and Debs. But what the book talks about is trying to find a way to bring the country back to its roots, to its origins. And we can do that by drawing this line, focusing on conduct rather than speech. An example I give is that there was a group of anarchists that were arrested in New York and Pittsburgh and other cities because they were anarchists, because they opposed the war, because they opposed the United States. I don't believe that it should ever be criminal to engage in revolutionary talk. I think that if a country cannot withstand people calling for its overthrow, then it loses its legitimacy. It's not the speech that is a crime. When a group of those anarchists then proceeded to build a bomb to try to kill an industrialist, that was conduct. That is legitimately subject to prosecution. So when a lot of anti-free speech figures say, oh, this is silly because a lot of crimes are committed by speech. Well, yeah. I mean, if it's a conspiracy to commit an act, like a conspiracy to build a bomb, surely then speech is part of that. But we can have a clear line of demarcation that the speech itself, the viewpoints themselves, cannot be criminalized. Much to our history, we have done exactly that.
Well, Jonathan, you and I share these beliefs, but we're constantly not only preaching to the choir, but trying to convert those who are open-minded or even hostile. So I know that you've encountered some of the same challenging questions that I have, and I would like to throw it back at you. What about evidence that's claimed, I'm not going to subscribe to it, but people say that there is evidence that speech that is psychologically, emotionally traumatizing has not only an adverse psychological and emotional impact, but it even has adverse physiological implications. So this is a separate kind of harm from instigating a third party to commit a violent or illegal act. It is the harm that is felt by the individual who hears the speech or at whom the speech is targeted, not because of something that, some conduct that's going to be triggered, but because of its immediate psychological/physiological impact.
No, I think, first of all, I think we have to start by acknowledging that speech can be hurtful. Speech can be traumatizing. When people say things about your identity and who you are, that can be really emotionally quite damaging. And we have to find a way to draw that line. For example, universities police a healthy environment. That is, if you have people who are attacking individuals, who are making, essentially preventing them from being on campus by threatening them, obviously we have the right and the necessity to remove those people. But the line is not as ambiguous as it would seem. That is, those are direct threats. Those are people who are targeting other individuals, and not the type of speech that we more often deal with on campuses. And that is speech that is viewed as just inherently harmful because it devalues a group of people, or it is offensive to others. If you look at the speech codes in many universities, terms like offensive, making people feel uncomfortable, intimidating, those are all words that are so subjective that it wipes away a great amount of speech. And we can't allow that to happen. And so the fact is, and I don't mean to evade this point, being a free speech advocate means that a lot of bad speech is protected. It means that people who you find obnoxious, even grotesque, will be able to speak. But you have to have a faith. Maybe you take a leap of faith that speech is its own solvent, that its own corrective measure. And if we look historically, it has been. What has not been a corrective measure has been censorship. And I have a long chapter in the Indispensable Right that goes into higher education. And if you want to see where this is taking us, you either look to Europe, where the free speech movement, anti-free speech movement has taken hold, or you look at on campuses. I mean, it's very different. When I went to the University of Chicago, I loved every minute of it. For me, it was like walking into the Star Wars bar scene. It seemed like everyone had a different viewpoint. And I lived in a vegetarian cooperative, and in the basement, Trotskyites would meet. And next door, we would have libertarians, and we had militant vegans upstairs. And you had every possible viewpoint, and I loved every bit of it because I was fascinated by how people could see what I was seeing and come up with such different ideas. It was a smorgasbord of different viewpoints. Today, it's been reduced to little more than a Happy Meal, right? It runs from the left to the far left, but no one's particularly happy, because all the polls show that both professors and students, a vast majority, feel that they cannot speak freely on campus. So it's sort of like Germany. What have we achieved in all of this, except creating this artificial silence, which we take as tranquility?
Yeah. It's interesting, since I raised the, to me, devil's advocate argument for censorship in terms of adverse psychological with physiological impacts of speech we don't like. Again, something else that I learned from your book that was completely new to me were the psychological indicia of shrinking creativity, shrinking ability to realize our potential as human beings if we are exposed to fewer and fewer perspectives. It's interesting. I, of course, from free speech, First Amendment point of view, have always supported intellectual heterodoxy as being necessary for the pursuit of truth. But I thought it was interesting that you talk about sensory deprivation and isolation among prisoners, and you, of course, have experience in working with prisoners. Could you just elaborate on that a bit, Jonathan? Because I suspect that will be new to most readers as well.
Yes, Nadine, early on in the book, I look at what free speech actually means. And this idea that the book advances, that we're hardwired for free speech. It's part of the human condition. And there are studies that indicate that there's even a physiological element to that studies have been made of prisoners in solitary, explorers that have had no contact for long periods of time. And there are physiological effects of that. The shrinking of areas like the hippocampus in the brain comes from the lack of being able to express yourself. People, I can tell you in my work with prisoners, I've only had 2 clients in my life that came out of long periods of solitary confinement sane. They were deeply religious, and that religion helped them. They were both Muslim, and they used prayer to sort of keep them sane. The rest of my clients, it took very little time before they started to go insane. And that is a fact that goes to how we are wired as human beings. And, I talk about the case of Phineas Gage, which some people may be familiar with. He was a foreman in Vermont who used to use a tamping iron to set off explosives for the railroad to remove rock. And on one terrible day, he ignited the explosives with his tamping iron, and it was blown through his head. And it blew off the front of his brain, essentially. And what came out of that was a doctor who realized that he should be dead, right? He showed up hours later, and he was able to talk to him. And he realized that frontal lobe, that cerebral cortex, was not necessary for life. And he figured since most of it was now gone, he might be able to figure out what its function was. Mm-hmm. And what was interesting about Gage is his friends said that he was able to function. He had various jobs, but he became almost animalistic. And that was a term used by his friends. He became violent, unable to have long-standing relationships, unwilling to face no or any dissatisfaction. He became less human. And those are the areas that indeed deal with expression. And so what the book is suggesting is that these studies indicate that free expression is not just simply this functional right that's great for democracy. It is great for democracy, but it's also something that may be essential for all of us to be human beings. The very concept of a starving artist who's willing to starve because he has to express himself, that's what we're hardwired for.
So you've already illustrated some of the fascinating characters whose lives and deeds and experiences you explore. So this is filled with philosophy and history, but also wonderful stories, including some who are well-known, like Oliver Wendell Holmes, but you give us a very different perspective on Holmes from the conventional perspective. And then you also talk about some people who are really unknown and uncelebrated, including to me, and I say to me because I have spent a lot of time studying the First Amendment. If you could just briefly talk about, there were a couple of judges in the Western United States, Montana and North Dakota, who were the opposite of Holmes in terms of their, lack of a fancy education, who got it exactly right about free speech long before the U.S. Supreme Court did so in the Brandenburg case in 1969. That was very impressive.
Yeah, the juxtaposition of Holmes with someone like Judge Borkman from Montana is particularly interesting, because here was a judge who was a cowboy. He was a miner. He was self-educated. He was gruff. He was a bit, as often the case with free speech advocates, he was a bit of a loner and irascible. But he had an inherent clarity of thought when it came to free speech. When Holmes was signing off on horrific opinions, silencing political dissenters, this Montana judge ruled in the opposite way when people were opposing the war. And he said, you can't just criminalize the opposition to a war. That's not what this country is about, what the Constitution's about. And there was just a native or inherent belief that comes out in those opinions. And there are other judges like him who stood in opposition to these to judges like Holmes. They had that clarity.
And at great personal cost, right? Being accused of being traitors and attempts to impeach them and remove them from office.
Yes.
So these are very remarkable. It's too bad that, and so thank you for restoring them to public consciousness, and hopefully they'll become the subject of biographies and admiration and emulation. Well, we have not too long to go in this interview, which I can talk to you forever, Jonathan, but I wanted to be sure to touch on the third of what I see as three major unique perspectives in your book. We've already talked about the importance of recognizing speech as a intrinsic human right. We've talked about the importance of the theme of rage. To me, the other unique aspect, most important unique aspect of your book was the theme of sedition. that you stress from the beginning through to the very most recent episodes in United States presidential politics. Could you, and you see that as something that we have to overthrow, that we have to finally reject the concept of sedition as a punishable crime, as deeply inconsistent with the First Amendment. Could you explain that?
Yes, I've been writing about sedition for many years as an academic, because sedition, when you look at the anti-free speech periods of our history, sedition cases run through them all. And it's not that they are used often in modern cases, but as we saw recently, we often reach for forms of sedition when we're angry or we're afraid. And that was the case with January 6th. But what the book goes back to is where sedition began, and that was in, of course, England. And many people don't realize that the infamous Star Chamber was basically a tribunal for criminalized speech. That what happened was that English judges, who were by no means particularly protective over individual rights, balked at claims that people who said unpopular or obnoxious things were traitors, because the Crown would just call you a traitor. And treason has elements. So these judges, at least, were a bit persnickety and said, well, we don't see the elements of treason here. So what the British Crown did is they created the Star Chamber and accused them of sedition so that they didn't have to prove the elements of treason. It had all the benefits of treason, but you didn't have to show that anyone actually was trying to overthrow the government. You were just speaking against the government. So the Star Chamber, which of course had few due process protections, started to issue these draconian punishments to people that would just make jokes in pubs or say mean things about the Queen or the King. Well, that Star Chamber ultimately became a law of sedition. It started creating the law of sedition that was known to the framers. Now you'll notice that they didn't adopt the word sedition. They didn't adopt, in fact, most of the framers saw the Star Chamber and sedition prosecutions as abusive. And yet, as soon as John Adams came into office, it was the first thing he reached for because he was familiar with it. They had used sedition against American revolutionaries, and then he used it against his critics. Now, the reason the book is so ardent about getting rid of sedition crimes is that we don't need them. That is, if you take a look at January 6th, you see why we still use the seditious conspiracy, which is different from the original sedition crimes. These charges are superfluous. They are redundant. They don't increase the time. They don't really increase the severity. So they are almost identical to the other charges. But we still use them because we want to charge someone based on what they thought, what they believed. And that's where sedition appeals. So we have a handful of cases that have been brought for seditious conspiracy. And it shows this continuing sedition addiction. And what I talk about in the book is that James Madison saw this for what it was. And I'm a Madisonian scholar, so my students right now are rolling their eyes that I can't speak for 10 minutes without talking about James Madison. But Madison wrote a brilliant paper in 1800, and he talked about the monster that lives within us, that this monster dwells within us and comes forth during periods of fear and periods of hatred. That monster is sedition. It is the criminalization of speech. And Madison saw Adams and later a bit of Jefferson for what they were. He saw them slipping away, and he warned them not to let this monster come back. It's time we slay the monster, and we don't need sedition in this country. We can make a clean break from history in that sense.
Well, speaking of history, one of the other major themes of your book, which we've touched on, but I'm going to ask a more pointed question. The subtitle is An Age of Rage, right? It's not The Age of Rage. And on the one hand, you show that this is a consistent historic pattern. On the other hand, you seem to indicate, and you did so at the beginning of this interview as well, that the current age of rage is uniquely dangerous for a couple of reasons. And one of the reasons is you talk about a triumvirate of forces in addition to the government itself that are raging against free speech. Could you comment on that, Jonathan?
Yes. I mean, the thing is, rage has been with us since the founding of our country. And what people don't like to admit is that they like it. They like rage. It's liberating. It's even addictive. It's contagious. And when you're in a rageful moment, you are righteous. But with the distance of time, you look at these periods and you see it for what it really was. Today, we're living in an age of rage where people want to silence others. But what's different is we've never had this triumvirate. We've never had the government, corporations, the media aligned in this way. And you throw in, of course, academia as well. And you have this alliance against free speech that we've never seen fielded before. And they are having a huge impact. And we are raising a generation, as I said, of speech phobics in that sense. And the book goes into detail about the censorship program that was revealed in part because of the Twitter files that were released after Elon Musk purchased that company. And a judge referred to that as Orwellian in size and scope. We have to come to grips with it because we've never seen anything like it. Many of the arguments, by the way, that they use, we've seen those before. That even though all of these people are saying, well, we're facing an unprecedented threat of disinformation, that was the exact argument used at the beginning of the Republic. Even fake news was a term used at the beginning of the Republic. So there's nothing new in what they're saying, but they have a far greater force really laid out against free speech.
I was going to raise that point because in all of my free speech evangelizing in the recent past, the speech that definitely has been the most controversial among audience members, especially those to the left end of the political spectrum, which includes most people on campuses, is disinformation. A few years earlier, it was hate speech that was the source of rage, the provocateur of rage, but disinformation, especially online, on social media, especially about electoral issues, especially about COVID-related issues, has been attacked as dangerous to democracy. So here we come full circle to the instrument. If the justification for free speech is that it promotes democracy, all you have to do is claim that disinformation undermines democracy, and that becomes a justification for censorship. Well, in fairness, we know that the social media companies have the right to engage in whatever content moderation, so-called policies they want. I assume that you support that, Jonathan. So could you comment a little bit more? This was recently before the Supreme Court, the crucial interrelationship between government and private platforms in ganging up against so-called disinformation.
Yes, I've testified on this in Congress as well as a good part of this book. And I do believe that this can violate the First Amendment. It is what I've called censorship by surrogate. That is, you can be an agent of the government even though you're a private company. I do recognize that these companies have free speech rights. But we have to look at the social media companies in a different way because they are social media companies. When they first were given immunity, they portrayed themselves, I think correctly, as akin to the telephone companies. And indeed, social media is now more popular as a form of communication than telephones. Now, could you imagine if you were on a telephone call and AT&T broke in and said, you know what, we've been listening to your call and we don't like what you just said, so we're going to cut the call off and we're going to suspend you from making further calls until you start to give better views and values in your conversations. People would go insane. They would say, how dare you do that? And yet they believe that social media companies can be given immunity and all forms of support and can do exactly that. And so I do believe it can trigger the First Amendment. But we also have to understand that the First Amendment is not the exclusive and full definition of free speech. It deals with the government, not private companies. But a lot of the anti-free speech figures try to convince people that if it doesn't fall within the First Amendment, it must not be a free speech issue. That's absolutely crazy. Free speech values go beyond that. These companies are violating free speech through this massive censorship system. And part of what this book tries to do is to get people to understand the full scope of those values as we deal with things like social media companies. And you have, what happened at Twitter was key. But Twitter's the only company that released those files. Facebook, other companies have refused to reveal the extent of their censorship. And so the problem is that the anti-free speech movement is very sophisticated. It takes a lot to get a free people to give up their liberties. They have to be afraid. They have to be very afraid. And that's
have made us. You've made us afraid. I'm interjecting here because we have so little time left, and I want to end on the upbeat note that you end your book on. Despite all of the challenges, you remain optimistic. I would like you to spend a little bit of time suggesting some of the steps that we can take to restore free speech to the robust human right that it was intended to be, and why you are optimistic that we can, in fact, do that.
Well, one of the reasons this book took me so long is I didn't want to publish it until I could commit a significant part at the end of how we restore free speech in this country. And there are things we can do. One is for Congress to prohibit the expenditure of a single federal dollar to support in grants or any other form projects to silence, target, throttle citizens. We need to get the government out of the censorship business. It doesn't mean that the Homeland Security cannot respond in their own voice. They always have that right. They can go on their own sites and say, what Turley just said is completely ridiculous. That is free speech. But to try to create this army of surrogates, as has been done, to actually target the revenue of some, of these sites, to seek the banning of individuals and groups, we need to get the government out of that business. We can also limit federal funds to universities that are antagonistic to free speech. If we had universities engaging in racist conduct, no one would suggest that we should give them federal funds. We should treat free speech as a value as important as our anti-racist policies. But despite all of what this book lays out in our history, and it is an unvarnished history of where we've been as a country, I am optimistic. And partially, there is a value to believing that free speech is a human right, because it has an inherent optimism that if you believe that human beings are hardwired for free speech, it's in our DNA, then you can never really extinguish it. All of the efforts of a censorship system might be able to reduce our appetite for free speech in short periods of time, but it'll never kill our taste for it, because it's part of being human.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. That's a perfect note on which to, unfortunately, we have to conclude. I am optimistic for many reasons, not least of which because you are so effectively exercising your free speech rights through this book and through your tireless advocacy to educate and inspire other people to exercise and defend free speech for themselves and for everyone else. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nadine. This has been a real pleasure for me and an honor. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you are interested in podcasts about nonfiction books, listen to C-SPAN's Book Notes Plus podcast for interviews with authors and historians hosted by Brian Lamb.